delighted to welcome you all today to the first live stream panel of Read for Action, the Humanitarian Book Club on Climate, Conflict, and Humanitarian Crisis. Read for Action is a project at the intersection of public humanities, environmental humanities, and public advocacy and policy change, based at the University of Virginia's Humanitarian Collaborative and in partnership with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It recently launched at the Global Climate Conference, COP27, in Egypt in November. My name is Adrienne Ghaly, and I'm a Humanitarian Collaborative Practitioner Fellow at UVA, a visiting scholar in the Department of English, and a primary architect of Read for Action, along with Professor Kirsten Gelsdorf, the Director of the Humanitarian Collaborative at UVA's Batten School of Public Policy. Our core collaborator at the UN is Ruth Makwana, a senior humanitarian affairs officer, co-creator of the podcast Stories and Humanitarian Action, and a fiction writer. Our student and postdoc researchers are Noah Strike, Nasima Mohammed, Lacey Wartzel, and Mary Margaret Lee. I want to just take a moment to thank our partners who make this project possible. We're supported by the UN Strategic Communications Branch team of Kirsten Mildren, Harriet Butterfield, Thomas DeMoule, and Dua Gashuka, as well as our advisory board members drawn from the New York Review of Books, the Philippines-based NGO Local Lab, and the UVA Environmental Resilience Institute. Read for Action is made possible by funding and support from the United Nations, the UVA Humanitarian Collaborative, the Environmental Resilience Institute, Environmental Humanities at UVA, Brown College, and the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, which is also hosting this event. And I want to thank Isabel Ostertag and Anne Gilliam for organization and technical assistance for today's event. Now, before I introduce our panelists today, I want to just speak very briefly about why we created Read for Action, and for those just joining us, how it works. Our project responds directly to an urgent challenge of humanitarian public advocacy now: how to increase and sustain public engagement on humanitarian crises, which are intensified and compounded by the climate crisis and intertwined with environmental justice issues. One of the origins of this project was Kirsten Gelsdorf's invitation to me to use my work as a literary scholar to help her and the Humanitarian Collaborative address this question. In my work, I'm interested in how fiction can mediate between individual experiences and large, complex systems. Put another way, novels offer granular views of complexity. And historically, of course, novels have always been used to educate and to change culture, from teaching the public about things like political economy to abolitionists seeking to sway public support for their cause. With these thoughts in mind, I ran an undergraduate class on the novel and what was then termed the refugee crisis. I just want to give you a very brief indication of the three key takeaways from that class. The first was that fiction really worked. We read nonfiction, poetry, journalism, and novels. With fiction in particular, students got to know characters in all their complexity before they were displaced. They did not meet affected communities already in states of abjection, but as fully rounded individuals with lives, desires, and interests of their own. Second, students reported that the novels propelled them to learn more about the real world situations that were context for the stories. And third, students connected to each other by arguing and discussing the stories. This sense of community was incredibly powerful. They felt they could act together and scale up their individual contribution to the issues about which they were reading. So we tried to replicate this structure. Read for Action brings together the power of contemporary global fiction with the realities of the global humanitarian response. First, it creates a large online reading community to read and discuss together contemporary stories of people caught in crisis. And second, our project connects the novels, readers, to real-time policy issues through audio and live stream events on our digital platform and our social media campaign. We bring readers together with policy professionals supporting the needs of affected communities from organizations such as UNOCHA, UNICEF, and Sesame Workshop, authors and academics who discuss the books in real-world contexts. And readers are offered pro-climate and pro-humanitarian pro-humanitarian actions they can take together. I would really urge you to find out more about the wonderful work that many of our collaborators and partners are doing with us at readforaction.org. And our co-host Kirsten Gelsdorf will put the information and the link in the chat. If you're an academic or teaching a course, please also consider assigning Read for Action in your spring courses. We have a syllabus insert. All you do is assign the books and we provide you with all the materials. So I'm just delighted now to introduce our three panelists today. Omar El Akkad is an Egyptian-Canadian author and journalist. He's reported from Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and many other locations around the world. His work earned a National Newspaper Award for Investigative Journalism and the Goff Penny Award for Young Journalists. His debut novel, American War, from 2017, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 13 languages and selected as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and others. The BBC chose it as one of the 100 novels that changed our world. His fiction and nonfiction writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Guernica, and many other newspapers and magazines. His most recent novel from 2021 is What Strange Paradise. Hawa Sabriye is an education specialist at UNICEF Somalia and has years of experience in education, humanitarian aid, and international development. She holds degrees in English literature and human geography and education, and graduate diplomas in refugee and migration studies and post-secondary education, community, culture, and policy. She previously worked as a humanitarian affairs officer for UN Somalia. Hawa is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto in the International Education Leadership and Policy Program. Her research focuses on trauma-informed teaching and learning in Somalia, and her interests include Afrocentric education and reading. Bruce Holsinger is Lyndon Kent Memorial Professor of English at the University of Virginia, editor of New Literary History, and a fiction writer. His newest novel, The Displacements, in 2022, which we'll be discussing today, imagines a near future of mass climate migration and internally displaced people in the United States and North America. He's also the author of a burnable book, The Invention of Fire, and The Gifted School. His fiction has won the Colorado Book Award and the John Hurt Fisher Prize, and he's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. So I just want to let people know that we are going to be talking with our panelists today in a conversation about using fiction to connect to humanitarian crisis, and also about Bruce Holsinger's latest novel, The Displacements. And I would encourage you to open the Q&A box and post questions for our panelists. We also have several questions and clusters of questions that current readers already placed on Discord, and you can find a link to our Discord conversation on readforaction.org to participate in the conversation that way. So I just want to begin by asking all of you, and perhaps we could go in the order in which I introduced you, Omar, Hawa, then Bruce, to ask you why, for you, the novel is a valuable cultural form for connecting readers to humanitarian crisis, or what do you think fictional stories can do especially well?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Thanks so much for having me, by the way. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here, and to be by far the least distinguished member of this panel, which is something I've become quite used to over the years, but even by my standards is a bit of a stretch. When I started reading this book, I was immediately taken back to the last time I was in Florida on a reporting assignment. I was doing a story on climate change and the number of towns in southernmost Florida where mayors are starting to tell their residents, like, listen, your grandkids are probably not going to be able to live here. Like, this might be a port of some kind or something like that, but you're not going to, it's not going to look like this. And I was talking to this researcher who had been sounding the alarm about this for like 30 years. And he goes to every community that'll have him, and he'll talk about this. And whenever he does these talks, he'll bring a relief map of the area he's in. with these overlays. You know, this is what it's going to look like with 1 meter of sea level rise, with 2 meters, and so on and so forth. And he was telling me that invariably when he goes to these community groups and does this, afterwards somebody will walk up to him and point to a spot on the map and say like, oh, my house is going to be okay. And he's like, yeah, but you need a canoe to get to the grocery store now. Like you just happen to live up on a hill. Like that's what this map is showing. And I think about that a lot because I think of fiction, and I think of the novel form in particular as being a particularly effective antidote to that kind of thinking. Your reading is an incredibly individual experience that is nonetheless also an incredibly communal experience. And it forces you to dwell, and it forces you to look at somebody else's experience. And all of those things, I think, are in really short supply right now. I think we live in the kind of environment where it is perfectly okay for a lot of people to be sufficiently outraged about the bad thing that's happening today, and then tomorrow wake up, completely forget about it, and move on. And I think the novel form is a really effective antidote to that. So that's what I retreat into when I get really depressed about the state of the world.
Should I just jump in here?
Please do.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm honored to be speaking with Bruce and Omar. When I think about novels and fictional storytelling and connecting it to like humanitarian crises, for me, what it does is it really helps humanize headlines. So like we read about conflict, we read about mass displacement, environmental disasters, and we also get these images that are really shocking, you know, like a child being, you know, washed up on a shore, the aftermaths of like flooding. And it can be really overwhelming, I think, for people who, you know, feel that it's very unrelatable and so far removed. But what storytelling does, I think it helps us start conversations. It break down like these emotional walls, and it gives us insight into these characters that we can almost relate to, or at least empathize with. And when I was reading the Displacements, for a second, I had to Google and see if Bruce, like, did he work for OCHA? Because a lot of it reminded me of my experience when I was a humanitarian affairs officer. And I had a hard time explaining to my friends or family what exactly I do, or when I visit like an IDP camp, what is it that I see? And I think if I recommended this book, it could give them more insight. And I think when it comes to storytelling, it can also give power and also validate people's experiences, even if it's like experiences that have passed. You know, it allows people to connect with characters, but also like in a real life situation. You know, for me, like my earliest experience of relating storytelling to like a humanitarian crisis was, I remember in primary school, I think I was like in grade 3, and we had a new student whose family fled the Bosnian War, and he was describing it for us. And I remember him crying, but also being so confused, like from his own experience. And a few weeks later, our teacher read us this book, and I'll never forget it. It's called Far Away by Robert Munsch. And it's about this girl who fled Lebanon during the war, and she became a refugee in Canada. And I remember as a child, that book helped me humanize the experience of my peers. So that's, for me, that's the power of storytelling and connecting it to humanitarian crises.
And I just want to echo the gratitude for being part of this panel. It's so flattering to have you both here talking about this novel, and to have so many of the readers on the Discord channel and as part of Read for Action. You know, one of the ways, but I had something I was going to say, but what you two said, Omar and Hawa, was so compelling that I immediately just started thinking that, well, you know, a novel, there's something about reading a long work of fiction that can move us in various ways, you know, emotionally, psychologically, politically, ethically. But every novel is composed of a lot of small stories at the same time. And it's the working of those small stories that I think is just as important as the work that any novel can do. And Omar, that anecdote that you gave about, people coming up to that geographer or whoever, the activist, whoever it was that you met in South Florida, pointing to their house on a map and saying, "Oh, well, thank God, I'm at that altitude. I'll be all right." That's such a fantastic example of climate complacency. That is one of the big targets, I think, of this novel. I wasn't really thinking of it that way when I started it, but making that this kind of shaking complacency by the shoulders and asking it to take a look at where the world is and where it's going, and including, and especially given the theme of the novel, in so many Gold Coasts around the world, very affluent communities, and to realize what's coming for those communities in so many different ways. And then Sawa, that point that you made about the child washing up on the shore, and the horror of that, and the provocative aspect of that in terms of story. I don't know if you've read Omar's most recent novel, but that's exactly how his book begins. What Strange Paradise, of a child washing up on a shore and thinking, that I don't know, Omar, if you were thinking of that iconic image of the refugee crisis, but it's also just turning that into a different kind of beginning of a story, and making it taking that small story of one individual, of one child, and turning it into a much, much larger story. And I think, when confronting crisis and dealing with, the horrific things of the world, I think always having an eye for the very small story within the larger story. And I think that is something that I hope we can talk a little bit about today.
I'm sorry, Adrienne, I'm a bit of a nerd, and I'm just going to start rambling if you don't control this conversation. So please feel free to launch questions at us. Otherwise, we'll start
nerding out.
Start the incestuous gossip.
What do you? But I mean, Bruce's question is a good one. It also speaks to one of the questions that I had with the book and with yours is the focus on children, right? Because in Bruce's novel, and in yours too, in What Strange Paradise, having the child's eye view of humanitarian crisis seems an incredibly powerful way to sort of get to that micro story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Bruce, do you want to start us off? I'm happy to, but again, I've got so many questions for you set up, so
sure.
I'm gonna.
Well, so the novel begins in the middle of a children's game. Actually, it's a game that I kind of invented for the book called Range, and it gives the kids in this displacement shelter. It's a mega shelter in the middle of Oklahoma, and the book kind of starts in the middle of things after the main family has been there for a few weeks, and I don't know why I started the book that way. I don't know if I originally started it, but it was a way of getting you right on the ground in a literal way, from a child's point of view, and thinking about the ways that children experience displacement, hardship, but also the new communities that are forming in any large group of people that have been in the same place, even if they don't know each other, and what those forms of community might look like. As a form of resilience, in a way, a game, a source of joy and entertainment, even in the midst of really difficult, challenging conditions. So for me, that was one of the motivating factors, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a similarity there. I think the first time I was asked about this, I went back and looked at, both novels, the 3 unpublishable novels I wrote before then, a bunch of the short stories, and a lot of it starts from the perspective of a child. And I think, in addition to what you just talked about, there's a sense of, I don't know that you can write about this sort of stuff and not have a level of outrage at the kind of systems we've allowed to take over our planet. And those systems have a kind of fundamental fraudulence to them, in the form of the lies that they have to tell in order to be deemed legitimate. And so colliding that with childhood, which I think of as the only really fundamentally honest time in our lives, seems like a thing I retreat into a lot. The collision between the fundamental honesty of childhood and what I think of as the fundamentally fraudulent nature of hyper-capitalism and sort of the things that got us to where we are.
And the bureaucracies that go along with them, which I think is something that I know you've written about, and the kind of impenetrable languages and idioms of bureaucratic controls of migration, of settlement, and so on. So, something that is always going to spark that kind of imagination in a fiction writer, I think.
And I'm just going to interject here for just a second and just say that What Strange Paradise, just to give the background for those who haven't read it, is a story of a child who has washed up on a Greek island and is a refugee and is helped by another child to evade the authorities, right? To evade those who are trying to place him in a displacement camp. And so it's the story of the two children sort of helping each other in different ways. And with Bruce's novel, the Category 6 hurricane that displaces millions of people from Miami, and then from the Galveston, Houston area, a large number of the cast of characters are children who are in this camp, and they don't have access to education, but where education and play kind of come in all these different ways. Is one of the kind of wonderful ways that your book thinks about. I think your book actually sort of thinks about infrastructure in a really smart way. And it's one of the reasons, I mean, maybe this is also a moment, Hawa, where you might come in, because, one of the reasons that we wanted to think in this community about Bruce's book is that we have so many voices, right, from different levels of emergency, relief workers, infrastructure, education specialists, nurses, who are all coming in different ways to sort of lend their voice to this kind of very complex situation. And it sort of had me in mind of some of the kind of great social novels almost of the 19th century, kind of much older form of historical fiction that's seeking to sort of show large structures and then the small stories of individuals embedded in that. But education is a theme that has come up and that many people have talked about on our Discord. And to just think about the realities of education and displacement and relief camps. And we had Sesame Workshop come in, Emily Guerin, and speak to the Read for Action community about how they're bringing education into displacement and relief camps across the world. So how you had said that, it almost seems like, Bruce's novel, he's describing your experiences as a worker in OCHA. And so perhaps you could describe a little bit about the challenges that you've faced in this realm. And then perhaps, Bruce, you could tell us a little about your research after Hawa.
Yeah, I think reading the book and just, starting with Daphne, like how displacement can be very gendered. And I don't want to spoil the book for people that haven't read it, but I think like the bombshell about her husband, like you see that when you go to IDP camps in Somalia, most of them are filled with women and children. And I think reading this story from, for example, from Mia's perspective, even though she was a child, it helped, I think for me at least, to empathize with her quicker, because you're thinking, how could a child be experiencing this? And then when they refused education, for me, that was so normal, because I see that all the time. Like people that are living in these IDP camps all across the country don't have access to education. Most of the children who have grown up living through these recurring drought after drought, flooding, cyclones, that are just moving from place to place, have never even stepped into schools, So and it's interesting because I finished this book last week while I was in the field, and I was visiting an IDP camp where we're setting up a temporary learning space for children who have never attended schools. And so we're like describing how we're going to be building this makeshift school for these kids that essentially have been denied education, even though that there are schools maybe within the host community. And it reminded me of when Daphne took the kids to the school, and they said, we can't We can't take them. Even if it was just these two, then we'd have to accept all of them. And I see that all the time in this work, but especially I think the gendered aspect of how displacement, a lot of the burden of it falls on the woman, unfortunately, and of course the children. Yeah.
That's such an amazing connection. The thought that you were reading it while you were doing that, and it is uncanny. I'm I'd love to hear what some of those challenges specifically about stories when you're setting up schools like that in your experience, and what, because I was imagining, story time at the mega shelter library, right, where people are donating books and there's a librarian there, and that kind of goes south. But there's also a way that I'd love to know what role storytelling plays, and how, are there physical mediums that help with that? Is there a sense of people who come in as storytellers and help shape experiences of young people?
When it comes to Somalia, unfortunately, education it's kind of looked at as a last resort. Looking at primary education, for example, Somalia is only 24% enrolled. So most children, we have over 3 million children who have never or don't go to school. And so when it comes to the element of storytelling, at least what I find most important going into these IDP camps is, well, what are the children doing? Like reading about the range and how they interact with each other. How are they building these social skills? Like the conflict that Mia had with, the different communities that started to come up. To me, that's most important, especially when I was working for OCHA, because it's all about life saving. Now that I've transitioned over to UNICEF, I'm now more focused into the delivery of education, and how is that going to look in an environment that students don't know how to read, they don't know how to do math, but they do know how to play. Like I see how they keep themselves busy within the camp, and the communities that they start to form within this giant, IDP camp. But for me, what's constantly on my mind, and I don't think I have an answer to, is, how are they spending their time? Like if you're not in school, and of course this is because I've come from a very sheltered experience of myself going to school, straight from kindergarten, and, I'm still in school now, but it's still something that I'm trying to address and trying to understand. Like, how do you put, an 11-year-old with maybe a 5-year-old, and they're both at the same level? And so right now UNICEF is looking at providing accelerated basic education. So how do we get people to at least learn how to read, to do basic math, and looking at not at their age, but looking at supporting the abilities that they're at. But I'm only 1 month into this job, so it's something that I'm still exploring, and I'm enjoying it, but it's definitely a challenge. Yeah.
So Bruce, can you talk a little bit about your research for this book? Because you seemed to be able, in an almost uncanny way, to bring in exactly some of the challenges that Hawa's describing, right, in dealing with education and IDPs, but also basic things like infrastructure. How do you set up a camp? What are the choices that are being made? What are the challenges that people are facing? And I know that you did speak to many different people and do a lot of research. Maybe you could give us a little bit of an insight into that process for you, and what you learned what was sort of most astonishing to you as a person who's outside of the humanitarian aid world.
So I befriended and interviewed quite a number of relief workers, and people who have worked with Doctors Without Borders, or people who have been involved in the kind of direct work that Hawa has been, or that our colleague Kirsten Gelsdorf here at UVA has been, and that in those, a lot of that kind of interviewing, whenever I interview people for one of my novels, like for my last one, a pediatric neurologist, someone who who could tell me the details of a particular kind of profession. One of the main things you get is stories. You precisely get, mini narratives about individuals and about people, and also about the, what it means to be in that situation. There's one moment where Rain, the woman who works for FEMA, who's kind of in charge of this displacement shelter, where she's thinking about what it's like to be in the middle of a camp full of starving children, and then to go back to her own camp, to kind of the headquarters camp where the relief workers are staying, or maybe go into town and be able to have the privilege of having a beer and a meal at a restaurant, even while she's been working with starving people during the day. And those kinds of juxtapositions, that's one of the things that I don't know if they call it research, but my conversations with people would bring out. Of course, I also did a lot of reading and these are the sorts of apparatuses in some ways that Omar was talking about, a lot of reading in government documents about what actually, and remember, this mass displacement shelter is being constructed, a number of them are being constructed in the novel around the southern United States. So they're specifically subject to American laws, American jurisdictions. So a lot of my research was figuring those sorts of things out. Like, and there are, for any question that you might possibly want to ask about a relief shelter in the United States, there's going to have been generated a government document about it. And so there are documents about, firearms in FEMA shelters. What do you do when there are laws on the books in certain states that say you don't have any right to take arms away from anybody in any location? And how does something like FEMA negotiate that? Or sexual offenders in federal shelters. If you're emptying a jail and these people have to go somewhere, or if someone's just a registered sex offender and is not incarcerated, how can we maintain the registry if you're throwing 5,000 people together in a big gym, right, or in a stadium? So it was I think my jaw was often on the table reading some of these government documents and the level of detail that people have thought about. But just, of course, when you're writing a novel, to make that come alive and to choose only those details that will be most helpful. So, and then finally, another kind of strand of research was, of course, on storms, and talking to people at the National Hurricane Center at the University of Miami, people who work on Atlantic hurricanes and about severity and so on. So those were the main strands that I was working on.
I'm just curious, on the back of what Bruce said, what you, Hawa and Omar, thought of the story within the story. For those of you who haven't read the book, within the story of a mass displacement that follows a family from Florida to a mass displacement camp in Oklahoma with about 10,000 people, there is a story within the story which is set maybe about 5 years in the future of the novel, which is an oral storytelling project. It's sort of a digital humanities project that gathers all these different voices, from meteorologists to addiction nurses, and lets them tell their story with the disaster, in the rearview mirror, but still having fundamentally changed the landscape and to some extent some of the cultures in the United States. I just was wondering what you thought of that as a device to think through these sort of much bigger problems. I thought it was, to me, it was incredibly compelling to sort of see the novel's kind of almost, sort of intense democracy of all these voices bringing their, conversation to the table in these little snippets interwoven with the main characters' stories.
And I would also love to hear Omar talk about your research too for What Strange Paradise and what that was like, because your book, I think, is so almost effaces that. It can be so hard to not show off your research when you're writing a novel, but there's just something so kind of minimalistly wonderful about that, the way that you handle it there.
I mean, thank you. That's incredibly generous of you. To go back to Adrienne's question, I'm a sucker for that sort of thing. Like and when it's done well, it gives the novel a kind of textural element that I think you really can't get otherwise in a straight narrative. And for me, especially with this book, one of the things, I mean, I'm a very petty reader because I'm also a writer. So when I see something I like in a book, I'm always just jealous and kind of pissed off about it generally. But I was curious about this, Bruce, because like this is a book that moves. Like the velocity of this book is really quite astounding. And yet you've got all these structural elements in play at the same time. You know, the POV is shifting. There's a website. There's, you know, like this sort of the number of elements going on is really astounding to me in a book that moves this well. And I guess one of the things I was curious about, and I'm more than happy to talk about the research for What Strange Paradise as well, but I'm curious about the order in which these things come to you. What is the hurricane the first central protagonist that shows up when you're constructing a book like this? And structurally, sort of, what order do these things fall in? Are things coming to you? Are structural ideas coming to you like in the third or fourth draft, or are you pretty well set with what you're doing from the get-go?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I suppose I'm always, yeah, the hurricane was clearly going to be a character. And I think some of those omniscient chapters, the short omniscient chapters from the hurricane's point of view, where we're getting that those were some of the first chapters I wrote. But as far as the Great Displacement, this digital chronicle that you see at various points throughout the novel, I wish I had a screenshot so I could show you how it actually looks on the page. But you know, that I think that came to me maybe in a second or third draft, to answer your actual question, because oh, there it is. Yeah, so you see this it's kind of a digital chronicle. The conceit is that it's a digital humanities project that was created by a collective of people at a university some years after the fact. So we're not going like 100 years into the future, but it's, you know, it's the novel is set in our present or in our very, very near future. And then this is maybe a few years on, kind of looking back retrospectively at it. And I think I felt the need for this in a second or third draft when I was doing a lot of information dumping in exposition, in, you know, in writing, like, here's what the shelters looked like, you know, and I had these awkward bits of dialogue between people because I needed to get this information out there. And so the book, the main narrative of the book is mostly about this one family and then a few other people that we meet along the way from their points of view. And it's a small story about what happens to this family, but I needed to set it within a much larger story. And so, you know, I using the device of a digital humanities project as a way of kind of backing up and including a lot of different voices and, you know, first person testimonies from people. And I've always loved that kind of voice, the multiple first person voice, even though the novel is written in third person. And I, you know, reading, you know, oral histories like Studs Terkel, like Hard Times, or especially ones like Voices from Chernobyl. I don't know if you know that book by Svetlana Alexievich. And you see it, and you see the technique used in fiction too, like Max Brooks' World War Z, which is an oral history of the zombie wars. It's a spectacular novel. I think it was published like 15 or 20 years ago, but the whole thing is an oral history, a fake oral history of this war with zombies. And then, or something more recent, like Taylor Jenkins Reid, what's that called? Daisy Jones and the Six, which is an oral history of a rock band that of course never existed, but the novel, you know, uses that. And so that, you know, I feel like that kind of framing those, I'll stop, but, you know, it can help set the smaller story that you're telling within a much larger story. And I remember that from American War, right? Didn't you include like sample syllabi and things like that from a course that would be taught on the events that happen in the story that you're telling? I mean, I remember that, I think. I'm sorry, muted.
Yeah, it was a really sort of fascinating construction for me. I think that the place that I mean, one of the things that I really loved about this book is that it sort of, it collides directly with the idea of when you think about climate change, at least in my mind, there's always this tendency to think about it as this sort of overarching thing that we can all get involved in because it supersedes all our issues of class and race, because it's a whole planet. But of course, it doesn't supersede anything. It's overlaid on top of all of this stuff, right? And so, when I was thinking about the structure of this book and the movement of it, I kept coming back to this collision with privilege, right? You write a book like this, and almost by definition, it's going to be called dystopian. But I do think of sort of dystopian a lot of the times is like it's happening to the rich white folks, right? Like that's what makes it dystopian. Like, when it happens on the other side of the planet, it's gritty realism.
Yeah.
And so all you're doing is sort of taking this thing and then sort of casting it on the rich white folks and seeing all of a sudden the way it's interpreted is much more of a monocle popping, like, oh my God, how could this happen? They have a pool. Like, how could this happen to people who have that to me was one of the parts of this book that I think I was most engaged with. Because even though I think it comes with a serious opportunity cost, right? Like I think it comes with a serious sort of framing opportunity cost in terms of how folks on this side of the planet in particular are going to read it and instinctually react with a version of the same problem I have with a lot of how this stuff is classified in the first place. Sorry, that was sort of a very rambling aside, but it was one of the first things I thought about when right from the get-go, right? You get past the prologue and you're right there in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the problem of, it relates to that problem of, I think that Lydia Millett had this great essay about climate fiction in general, about like, don't call it a genre. Don't try to squeeze this into a narrow form of fiction that is given the overwhelming problem that the books are addressing, right? So it's, yeah, and the novel is self-conscious about that, the problem of privilege, of white people in peril, but that's, as you say, you're only going to be able to take that so far. But I love your point about dystopia, and that's a powerful point. That this is, we call it dystopian when it's dealing with the problems, the crises of a particular population.
I liked, Bruce, that you described this as a riches to rags story, and that the one of the reasons that we wanted to assign this novel is that the majority of our novels are located in and also written by authors in the global South. But we thought it was important to include a humanitarian crisis in at least one global North country, in part because, as you said, and as many other climate fiction writers have said, that climate change is coming for everyone. And also, to Omar's point, the intensification of all of the social problems that the US faces, the climate part of it is essentially intensifying the climate crisis. It's intensifying the kind of wealth disparities, right? The wealth gaps. It's intensifying the lack of a social safety net for everyone in the United States. And so one of our collaborator at the UN, Ruth Makwana, said early on in the process, it's really important to me that we don't have humanitarian crisis only take place in the global South. And Kirsten Gelsdorf, also was deployed with Hurricane Katrina. And so not a lot of Americans perhaps know that the UN was actually deployed for Hurricane Katrina for relief there. And so that was one of the reasons that we thought, in addition to this sort of way that you zoom out onto these larger structural problems with the story within the story, was one of the reasons we thought this would be a great book to read. But I want to just sort of jump in with a question for Hawa that relates to this, and it's coming in from one of our readers on Discord. And they're asking about how the humanitarian landscape is changing around the world due to climate and conflict, that climate is an intensifier of all these humanitarian needs, right, and crises. It's creating its own challenges. And the reader would like to know what some of the biggest challenges the sector and individual aid workers are facing in light of climate.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'm going to try to relate it to the book because a character in the book that I really resonated with was Rain, and I viewed Rain as a humanitarian worker, and almost like reading her experience working in a camp. And you know, she told this story of how she had this photo taken of her helping a baby during a flooding, and people viewed her as resilient, as strong, as, you know, you could take on any challenge. And I think a lot of people view humanitarian workers like that. And I think when we have multiple crises going on, so like looking at the crisis in Ukraine, the drought in East Africa, you have a lot of humanitarian work that's being scaled up, which means a lot of surge is happening. So it's when you send in humanitarian workers into these crises, and I think this work is really popular. So you're seeing a rise in the amount of people that are coming into this line of work, and the amount of people that are being pushed into what we call the field. But when I looked at Rain, I saw a humanitarian worker who is on the brink of burnout. And I think that's one of the main challenges in this line of work, because if you are a humanitarian worker that's on the brink of burnout, you're not able to respond to the crisis effectively. And so Rain really resonated with me because she reminded me that it's okay to accept that you're suffering from burnout. It's not a sign of weakness or a lack of ability. And it's this phenomenon that I think is growing within the humanitarian world, within the humanitarian sector, within people who are driven to just help others and work in this challenging environment. But if we neglect our own well-being, we're not going to be able to do this important work very well. So I think that's one of the main challenges that I see. And then, of course, you know, with climate change, we're just seeing a rise in crises that are coming up that are unexpected. And so I think there's so much work to be done and not enough bodies that are able to properly respond effectively. Yeah, I think that's one of the main challenges. And I could even talk about vicarious trauma and other things like that. But I think that's the main challenge that I see.
would love to hear, you know, that notion of burnout. I would like, are you, where have you, what's a kind of example of that among, you know, colleagues of yours? Like, are there, like, how does it work? Because we, you know, there's a kind of relativism of burnout, I think, you know, I'm grading too many papers, right? It's a different word. And I just would love to know how you've seen that with your friends and colleagues and what it looks like.
So, okay, fun fact about me, I'm from Toronto, Canada, but I live in Mogadishu, Somalia. So I'm actually working as a Somali. So I'm a Somali Canadian. I live here with my parents. And so my experience working here is very different than like an international staff, because I live and work in the city. And one thing that I think I was really challenged with at the beginning of working within this sector and living within also this kind of crisis was my experience with vicarious trauma. So for people that don't know what vicarious trauma is, it's essentially this kind of change that happens in you when you are working with people that have been hurt, or, you know, you feel committed and responsible for them, and you experience changes that are, you know, mentally, physically, and also spiritually well-being, because you want to effectively respond to all of the crises that you're seeing. So when you walk into an IDP camp, it's nothing like you see on TV. Like the first time I saw a child that was malnourished, it really shook my core. Because it's one thing seeing a photo of a child that's like skin and bones, but then when it's right in front of you, it's actually quite scary. And so I had to deal with all of these weird feelings that I was feeling. And the first thing that I did was actually like, I did seek help, because I'm a firm believer in therapy, and just talking about it, because I noticed that my approach to work, I just felt very overwhelmed. I almost felt like Rain when she had that kind of explosive episode at her daughter. You know, you're trying to explain to someone what you're doing is making an impact, but maybe from the outside, people see, well, there are thousands, millions of people that are still displaced in Somalia. Like I have people that say like, well, the same thing is happening again and again. Like, how is what you're doing making an impact? And so conversations like that, and when the work does feel very very repetitive. And I remember she said something, Rain was saying something like, what was it? It was like practical or compromise or something, moral compromise. Like I feel that all the time, sometimes with my work, because it's like, I'm thinking, is what we're doing actually making an impact? And when you keep doing something over and over and it's making maybe like a drop in the ocean, it does lead, unfortunately, to burnout. And especially if the environment is not that conducive to like supporting your well-being. I think that's how a lot of humanitarian workers get burnt out. And I think if you're able to effectively address it, so speaking about it, building better work habits and healthier habits in your life, then we can approach this work more effectively, essentially. But yeah, vicarious trauma. So if you know any humanitarian workers, or if you're thinking about becoming one, definitely look into it, because yeah, burnout in this sector, I think it looks different, but I think it can be addressed. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And actually, it speaks to several questions that we had from our readers who were asking you about what your experiences were like on the ground, and if you would be willing to share that. Thank you so much. And I wonder, Omar, you know, you're a journalist as well, right? You're sort of you're kind of on the, you're a fiction writer who's thinking about how fiction can tell these stories, right? That how is resonating with characters like Rain, but you're also a journalist who is interviewing communities, right? Who are on the forefront of crisis and climate crisis. And I wonder if you would maybe share with our you know, our listeners today and our readers kind of what your perspective is as a journalist, also trying to think about how you tell how you tell these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a weird place to sort of to exist in. You know, journalism by definition is about answers. If you don't have answers to the questions of who, what, where, when, how, you don't have a piece of journalism. Whereas I think of fiction as the place I go to sit with questions. There's very little that's sort of prescriptive about my fiction. There's no like, if we do X, Y, Z, where things will work out. In fact, I quite often do the opposite of that, where it's the sort of anyway, not to risk book sales, but they're all stone cold bummers. These novels I write, you know, I'm not interested in but that's this part of it, right? Is this notion of like how it does work, does real on the ground work that is important as affecting change. And one of the things I have a real problem with, just conceptually in terms of whatever it is I do, is this notion of, you know, by virtue of the kind of subject matter that I'm attracted to, that I want to write about, that I think is important to write about, I'm quite frequently a tourist in someone else's misery. And in journalism, that was in a real, literal sense of like dropping into a place like Kandahar, going out with the polio vaccination team, watching them do this very ad hoc thing because they don't have accurate mappings of the suburbs and they don't know how old these kids are, and the vaccine doesn't work after the age of 5. So they quite literally are going up to kids in the street and asking them to put their arm over their head. And if their fingers go past their ears, they assume that they're older than 5 years old. Like, and you're watching all of this and you're writing about it, and it's important to let the world know about it. And then you have the fundamental privilege of getting up and walking away at the end. And at least in journalism, you could say, well, the grossness of how I feel about that is offset by the fact that I'm putting this into the public record, and maybe somebody on Parliament Hill or somebody in Washington is going to read it and it'll inspire change. And there's a kind of built-in self-justification morphine drip that kind of kicks in. With fiction, that calculus is so much more abstract. And I don't know how to think about that properly yet, of sort of how it is to justify writing fictional stories about situations that are very clearly part of somebody's present. You know, I didn't make up refugee camps. I didn't make up drone killings. I didn't make up these things that feature quite heavily in my fiction. I might have repurposed them and I might have made them happen to people who are more privileged and so on and so forth. but I didn't make these things up. And so I have to, in my head, invent this offsetting factor of maybe somebody's going to read this book. Maybe it'll change their mind about how they think about this particular problem. Maybe it'll expand their spectrum of who gets to be designated human and who gets the fundamental rights associated with that, as opposed to who's fit to just be forgotten and not thought about at all. But it's a really tough calculus, because fundamentally I'm still that guy who is a tourist in someone else's misery. That's a really sort of ugly feeling to sit with, and I haven't been able to sort of reconcile it in my head yet.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. And I can, you know, I don't occupy that same space, but the way that you put that about how you are responsible to affected communities at the same time that you're thinking about the people who might be able to receive these stories, is one of the challenges, but also I think one of the things that we're hoping to sort of embrace, not answer, but embrace with this project, which is that we do want people to read about, as you know, as Hawa said, you know, I connected with Rain, this humanitarian aid worker. It helped me think, you know, about what I'm doing in my own work. And I know that for some aid workers, you know, that it is really reading novels. It's representing stories to ourselves, or reading stories not just for people who are outside of these situations, but also perhaps those who are in them, who are part of this community, that also helps think through, right? And sort of think through the issues that they themselves are facing. But I do think it is worth considering that, you know, one of the kind of wonderful things about novels is that it puts you in intimate relation with people with whom you may never actually meet in real life, or situations that you may not get to experience in any firsthand way, but the novel gives you access to that. Now, that access might be badly done. It might be vicarious. It might be, you know, there are irresponsible ways to do that, but there are also wonderful writers who, and I include, you know, everyone on this panel, who are thinking about how to represent these things, in part because I actually think that the intimacy of the novel's way that it gives you access to people's thoughts, feelings, experiences, and granular kind of daily life is quite different from other media. It's quite different from photojournalism. It's quite different from even, you know, from film, because there isn't quite the same distance, the kind of the objectifying distance that I think comes with a lot of visual media, where you're watching someone else's extremely challenging and painful situation. Instead, you're sort of right there with them in some way. And I don't want to get into the literary critical sort of scholarly language about this, but I do think that it is a valuable thing that the kind of the novel's wonderful kind of cultural moment that we're in. One of the reasons I taught the course was because after the Syrian crisis, there were so many novels that were starting to come out about people writing about this experience. And it seemed like the novels the publishing industry was sort of exploding with people wanting to tell these stories. And in a way, in fictionalizing it, there is a way to be responsible to affected communities, because you are talking about situations, but not exploiting real people.
You know, and I had a thought too in relation to Omar's point about tourism. I think that it's such a powerful and kind of devastating way to think about writing novels about difficult things that oneself is not experiencing or suffering. But it's a and I know you were using that to talk about journalism at first, but you know, with a novel of these sorts, of taking up these themes with these subjects, yes, there's an element of tourism, there's an element of journalism, there's an element of, you know, reportage. There's also anthropology, right? There's this kind of anthropological impulse in a novel that's about, you know, that moves between different cultures. But one word that hasn't come up is art. And I think there's also, you know, the importance of art, which is a big theme in the Displacements. But, you know, Omar, when I read your novels, it's, you know, you're experiencing the world, you're experiencing suffering, you're experiencing drone attacks, for example, through art, through the art of literature. And it's a, it's not just storytelling. There's an element there too that gives a sort of richness and power to those representations that I don't think can be ever reduced to just tourism or just anthropology or just journalism. There's something else there, and that's why we write them, right? It's that desire to leap into a different mode of engaging, not as a kind of disinterested practice, but as something that's kind of deeply meaningful and that can create different kinds of connections that we can never predict in advance, nor would we want to, I think. So that's just a thought inflecting the point that you were making.
I think that's wonderful, and we are reaching the hour, so I think that's a really wonderful note to end on for today. I just want to thank our panelists, Omar El Akkad, Hawa Sabriye, and Bruce Holsinger. This has been such a wonderful inaugural conversation of Read for Action. And I also want to thank my collaborators, Kirsten Gelsdorf at the Baton Policy School of Public Policy, and Ruth Makwana at the UN, our team at the UN, our students and postdoc researchers, and all of our funding bodies that made today possible. I would encourage you please to go on to readforaction.org to find out more about this project, to join our Discord community. You can leave your comments and your questions for our panelists today after today's event. And I also want to let you know that our next novel is Mohsen Hamed's Exit West, which is a wonderful novel about a couple in an unnamed Middle Eastern country, and magical doors start to appear that lead people in their country that's experiencing conflict and drought to places all over the world. So what happens when borders disappear? We're going to be starting reading that in December, and we're going to have our first conversations about that starting January 15th. I don't know if anyone on the panel has read the book, but if you have, perhaps you can vouch for its excellence. It was one of my favorite novels that I read with my students.
Yeah, an astonishing book. And I know, Omar, you said you reviewed it, I think.
Yeah, it's a tremendous piece of work. It's a book that I think, anyway, for whatever it's worth, could have been much louder and more overt, and decided not to be, with a construction that lends itself to a very lazy kind of loudness, and instead you get this very quiet, kind of quietly devastating book. I thought it was a brilliant piece of work.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad you think so. I think it's one of the most incredible novels I've read in the last 5 years. And I also want to just sort of flag that in February into March, we will be reading another incredible novel by Cameroonian, Brooklyn-based Cameroonian writer, Mbolo Mbue, called How Beautiful We Were. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists again for an exciting and rich talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. And thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.